Okay, continuing from last time, we talked about technology and the impact technology has. And we talked about the evolution of technology from, the early just pamphleteers and public speaking and presentations up to the use of newspapers and how that changed the ability of the public to get information. Still at a time when there was high illiteracy rates. The radio came along and we talked about the effective use of the radio, especially during the fireside chats during World War II and other opportunities such as that. And each one kind of moved forward in the process as we went along. And then today, the technology that we have is television came along, which added image to this whole notion of just the verbal aspects, so you're able to get nonverbal communication. We talked about the impact of television on politics, specifically referencing the Kennedy-Nixon debates, and how on substance Nixon was a clear winner, but on style and appearance Kennedy won, and that changed the dynamic. And so today we look for sound bites and short tomes, if you will, short blurbs that try to tell the whole story moving forward. And then this newest line with the internet, with social media, with some of the new and emerging technology, really changes the dynamic on how presidents communicate. They don't have to use traditional media. They can go directly to their followers through social media or put out blasts in a variety of ways. And the challenge becomes, as we talked about briefly on Monday, to what extent does our posts on social media reflect official statements by the president? And then how do you draw a distinction between what they're saying as president and what they're just passing off as their opinion about things? And you mentioned that one of the challenges of being elected official is whether you like it or not. Oftentimes, your statements are represented as coming from you by title, not from you by name, which complicates the process. We talked about some of the emerging challenges with the growth of artificial intelligence. That idea that it's becoming more and more difficult to tell what's real and what's being created by AI. That ability of AI to take your speech, your voice, your person, your characteristics, and create a completely artificial presentation, completely artificial discussion, or completely artificial statements, that it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to tell the difference between the two. The impact that will have, both positive and negative, as we move forward, gets to be critical elements of what we talked about. We talked about this slide as early on. Is using photographs or sketches change the dynamic. And so we started talking about this appeal to the public for approval. One of the things that the president has going for them, as we've already talked about, is almost instantaneous access to major news outlets. So if the president wants to come online and give a speech or give a presentation, they all just have to let the media know, and there will be channels that will be there live to cover it. But again, those then are also streamed on social media platforms. So depending on how the public gets this information, it's available in a variety of sources to make those things happen. One of the advantages of what the president can do in using that platform is identify issues and challenges and problems, try to generate public support for what it is they're trying to do and trying to accomplish. Educating the public is a major role that a president plays in terms of the issues and challenges we deal with. And through that, they can build support for a policy. What's the big challenge going on in today's world anytime a politician or a president makes a statement?
There's always people who spread misinformation.
Always people to spread a different perspective on what was said, a different view of what was said. They attempt to interpret the words that were said and use them.
They look on both sides of the
Absolutely. This is not a partisan issue. Both sides do it. Both sides have their spin doctors that get with the media immediately after a speech and try to redefine what was said and why it was said. Try to correct any misstatements that a president or a speaker may have made. And that's just ongoing. It has been. And then the fact that we've become so polarized as a nation means oftentimes if we have a different political ideology than the president, or we tend to believe a different narrative, nothing that president can say will ever be accepted by large portions of the population. And again, that happens on both sides of the issue. And that's one of the challenges we deal with. That's the good news, bad news, if you will, about the increase in social media, the increased reliance on non-traditional news outlets, that ability of not only the president, but all political actors to correspond directly with the citizens and bypassing the major filters, which are the media stations that come along. And that's creating a much wider dialogue, a much wider debate, which on the one hand is good, but on the other hand, because of the spread of misinformation, can in fact be very negative in the process.
Sometimes social media is trying to use algorithms to filter out misinformation. The problem with that is sometimes people think that's a breakdown of free speech.
You know, and that's a challenge the Supreme Court's dealing with, and major media corporations are dealing with as well. To what extent is free speech the ability to spread lies? Do we have a constitutional right to lie? Who should be the arbiter of truth? Who should be the arbiter of facts? And on the one hand, yeah, you know, it's kind of dangerous to have people coming out and saying that World War II didn't happen, or that the landing on the moon was you know, filmed in Hollywood or whatever it might be. But on the other hand, isn't that what free speech is all about? Isn't it up to us as citizens to be the regulators of what we tend to believe and not believe? You know, as we talked about before, you know, one of the challenges we have in this new media age is this idea acceptance without reflection is dangerous, because there is misinformation being spread. And unfortunately, the idea of misinformation or fake news has been translated to mean that with which I disagree. You know, obviously, if it's putting together a different point of view, it must be lies. It must be made up stuff. And how do we deal with that? How do we address those things? You know, the president's approval rating is historically supposed to be some indication of how well the public thinks the president's doing. But to what extent is how well the president's doing a personal opinion rather than based on any facts? Right? Unemployment rate is high. Employment numbers are higher now than they were 4 years ago. Stock market is higher today. Wages have gone up. Right? And yet most people are not. Yet most people don't feel they're better off today than they were before because of inflation. So who do we blame for high inflation rates? Obviously the president. And as we've talked in a variety of other ways, presidents get more credit than they deserve and more blame than they deserve. Nobody goes and looks at the massive profits being made by oil companies. Right? Why do you need to have massive profits and to have high gas prices? Don't know. Look at food companies and food producers and their profit margins. Anybody who has friends or family that are at a farm who raise dairy cattle, beef cattle, grains or whatnot, know they're not getting high prices for their work, but it's the middle side that's doing it. Grocery stores and manufacturers are downsizing packaging, doing it in subtle ways you don't know that you're paying more for less. So there are a combination of factors, and that applies to every president. But again, the president gets more credit than they deserve when good things happen, and they get more blame for things than they deserve when bad things happen, because there are all these external factors. And so that, again, is that good news, bad news about the rise of social media. Right? It gives a president or any politician a more direct pipeline to the citizens, but then you're competing with a lot more different perspectives, if you will. I have a good friend of mine who's an attorney, and I love the line he talks about. It says, I wouldn't say that people would lie, but there are many different ways to look at the truth. Right? And that's one of the challenges we face, is this perception of truth, and what goes on makes that difficult to do. You know, the images get to be important. It's the old notion, as we talked about last time, every picture tells a story, but that story may not be accurate because, again, subject to interpretation. We talked about body language and how body language gets impacted, and yet there are people who are very, very well versed in body language and can use it to manipulate audiences or a speaker in the way they address things. So image gets to be more important, again, as we become more of a visual society, as we tend to look at charts and graphs and pictures more so than reading the text below. So look at all the use that's been made of President Trump's mugshot. You know, on the one hand, that's not the most complimentary picture of all, but he may have been sending a message in his presentation of his disgust with the whole process. And so how we tend to view that makes a difference. When we see a picture of somebody,
because he may have cheaped it up, made it look bad on purpose.
exactly, telling a story with a picture, that gets to be an important aspect of what goes on. And we remember, the speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate, and all those images get to be important in this idea of how you frame your message, how you frame your statements, how you go out and use the backdrops to help illuminate or highlight the issues you're trying to address. And again, all those create that image, and if we don't read the text behind it or understand the context, it can be very distorting as how we look at those things. So one of the challenges that comes up is the resources available to the president. And one of those informal resources they have is the First Lady, their spouse. I guess now, who was it in South Carolina? We had a first gentleman, I guess we had when Nikki Haley was governor. But the spouse of the leader, that can play an important role in the public perception of the presidency, in the perception of their interest or whatnot in environmental issues. And perhaps the first major first lady who got attention was Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay? But what do we know happened? It came about in the mid-30s. What type of media became popular and got to be more and more around? Not only the radio, but the early television. Right? So you had that visual image that went along with it. So you could see her speaking with groups, speaking with children, going out and doing humanitarian efforts and things of that nature. And so what's kind of built up from that time is first ladies have their own agenda, their own special area, their special topic that they try to follow. Right? What was Michelle Obama's issue that she was most important about? School choice, school food programs, things of that nature. Had the gardens, went around highlighting those things. What was Ivanka Trump's? Not Ivanka, Trump. Melania Trump. Yeah, what was her issue?
I want to say that she was bullying.
Yeah, but you see how immediately we knew one, but not the other. Why? Because of the way they were implemented, the way they were done. And in some cases, one could suggest that one is an example where the first lady was overshadowed by the president.
I feel like it was also one that we experienced more because we were all in school when it happened.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And so her issue primarily was bullying and stuff, things of that nature. Justin was right. But, how does that come across? And then what happens is everything gets evaluated through what they say is important to them. So those roles have really picked up on each one. Rosalind Carter had an issue. Lyndon Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, was beautification. So they all have the issues that are important to them. Bill Clinton's wife was big into healthcare issues. Bush's wife, the second Bush's wife, was big into education because she came out of a teaching environment. So they all pick those things, and then they can help lobby the president.
I think Dr. Biden is also doing education.
Dr. Biden is also doing education, absolutely, and goes around talking to schools and things of that nature. Again, to bring publicity to the issues they think are important in the process. And in doing so, they become a great resource, or can be a great resource for the president in terms of extending their message and building, building public support for what it is they're doing or trying to do. Beautification projects. And this last bullet point here, Rosalind Carter established the Office of the First Lady. And what that gave them were the managerial and financial resources to pursue those issues related to their areas of concern. And it institutionalized within the system a role for the First Lady to play. And that's continued on to this day as we move forward. Betty Ford. What's Betty Ford? This shows support for the Equal Rights Amendment, which we know never got passed.
Because they put a time limit on it.
Oh, it never got passed, right. And so the question becomes, what else is she known for? And what are some of the things that she highlighted, maybe unintentionally, but was in so many ways a very positive impact of her time as First Lady? Yeah, this idea of substance abuse and getting treatment, the Betty Ford Clinic, the challenges she had, bringing those issues to highlight. And this is a bit off the wall, but look at what's happening with Princess Kate in England, right? What's become very much popular, she's now seen as a representation. The issue of cancer. This idea that not only happens to the poor and the lowly, it happens to those that have all the resources at their disposal. It highlights the issue that we have higher cancer rates among younger people than we used to, and what implications those have. So again, because of publicity, because of their position, they can use that to highlight issues and topics that are important to them, or in that case, are foisted upon them by nature to be able to highlight those issues and concerns. And that gets important when we think about the challenges that we all face. One of the lessons that we could learn on the downside was the role Hillary Clinton played in healthcare. She became the focal point for a lot of objections and concerns about it. So that's an example where too aggressive a role by the First Lady can in fact have a negative impact, can make it more difficult to do. And so as the last bullet point talks about, what we see them now as addressing less controversial issues. Because healthcare was, is, and going to continue to be a very hotly debated political issue. And in some cases, the issue isn't so much about healthcare, it's about the money and profit motives and things of that nature. And that's still going on today, some 25 years after Hillary Clinton and their attempts to do that, with this idea of extended Medicaid funding in what areas. So again, tend to do less controversial issues.
Although one of the more recent things that's trying to help with the prices is that Medicare, for those who are on that, and Medicaid can argue with the drug companies like private insurers to get the price low.
Well, that was passed by the Congress, this ability for the government to negotiate with drug companies for the price. And what was one of the activities that really highlighted the potential abuses of the drug companies in pricing their products? Happened about 4 years ago.
The pandemic hit.
No, insulin prices. Some money manager bought out an insulin firm and jacked the price up, 300-400%. And the next thing you know, he's out buying high price art and things of that nature. It really brought home greed and whatnot. And so that highlighted the issue. And then the point that you make is exactly right. Private insurers could negotiate, the government was limited. So again, that issue of healthcare being continued to be controversial as we deal forward. Yeah. So the president has a lot of things at his disposal, both formal and informal, and the role of and the reliance on the first lady or the first gentleman, as the case may be, to be a support, be an extension of the office, can be very powerful. Because again, as we've noted, they tend to address those topics that are less controversial, those topics that tends to impact a lot of folks. And the mere fact they show up in support of events and activities adds a credibility, increases donations, all of those things to the activities that go on. And this one is really interesting, the power to affect change without Congress. Right? We talked about the balance of power. We talked about the role the president has in making appointments and how they have to have the advice and consent of the Senate. He doesn't have to have the advice and consent of the Senate to fire somebody, to request their resignation. And then we talked earlier about this idea of recess appointments, where based on the law, if there is a vacancy for an executive level position that occurs during a time when Congress is in recess, the president can make what's known as a recess appointment. And we've had times in the past where Congress has remained in session, although with a skeleton crew, just to avoid going into recess to stop the president from doing those things. But that's an option for them that's out there.
And those people often have the title of acting position, but they happens before.
That's different than recess appointments. The acting is what's given if they waiting to get approval and they need somebody in the position. But usually that's not at the cabinet level. It's at the sub cabinet level, and they have the person in waiting. Pardons, we talked about that, and all presidents use it. One would hope they're used, as we talked about before, in the context of remedying a misplaced justice. But oftentimes are political rewards for contributors or symbolic releases. We talked about executive orders and the challenge that they present. They are, as the president is charged with implementation of legislation and the degree to which there is increasing ambiguity in legislation, that gives a flexibility to the president to issue what are known executive orders. One of the more recent one that relates directly to you folks is the ability to suspend student debt. Tried to deal with that as an executive order, which challenged. Supreme Court said he overstepped his boundary. So even with executive orders, although they have that power, we also have the checks and balances that make things happening. This is kind of a chart that shows the use of executive. Again, it's in your text. It's figure 12-18 in your text, and it shows the variable use of executive orders and how they're done. In a more in-depth look at what's going on, you'll find executive orders will be over time used during periods of emergency where action needs to be taken quickly, or in times when there's divided government, when the president does not control, the party of the president does not also control the House and the Senate, which makes things difficult to get through. Yeah, executive orders. Yeah, and this uses the example, I guess, is probably the best, is the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act is designed to give the president the authority to react immediately to a threat with notifying Congress, and then has a fixed amount of time to give a full report to Congress, and Congress has the option to overrule the president's decision if they don't think the situations are valid. That was extended after 9/11 for the issue of terrorism and terrorist activities. National security is a big issue, and so you can claim a national emergency, and that then gives you extra power, unilateral authority to deal with certain issues. But again, you have to be very careful in what you decide is a national emergency, because that, like anything else, can be overused over time. Executive agreements have to do with international relations, and we know the president has to have his ambassadors' advice and consent in treaties supported by the Congress. But these executive agreements can go beyond those things. And it's always interesting, the party out of power complains the president's using too much executive power until they get elected, and then the other party will complain they're doing too many. Politics gets played across the board in all of these activities that go on. Yeah. What's this talking about? This is an example of an executive order.
Well, yeah, this has to do with the internment. Looks like the internment camps.
Okay, what were the internment
They were
camps?
camps that were used primarily for Japanese Americans because they were afraid,
And
basically, that they were spies for Japan.
Okay, and what impact did they have on those that were interned?
Many of them, the survivors, were, let's say.
Yeah, part of the internment process is they could have their property confiscated and sold. A lot of them lost their homes, their businesses. That's what this picture is representing, is this idea. The Japanese American said, wait a minute, I'm an American. Right? And so on the one hand, one could argue that it was a logical response to being attacked. You know, that we had this fear of there being spies, you know, but to what extent might that have been overreach? The other argument is that,
I mean, when Germany ended up declaring war on us because they declared war on Japan, we didn't intern German Americans.
What was one big difference between our declaration of war against Germany and our declaration of war against Japan? Major difference.
Japan attacked us.
Yeah. Did Germany?
No.
Okay. So one could use that as an argument as to why we didn't have the internment of Germans. As a reaction to the Japanese because we were attacked. And there were evidence within Hawaii that there were spies that provided information.
It's also, I feel like it could be, we've already been attacked by them once. What's stopping them? If they have spies here, they're going to do it again.
Yeah,
They've already attacked us once, they're going to keep doing it.
Exactly.
Part of it, of course, it's also part of it was racism.
Well, you see, that gets to be a very interesting point to make. If in fact, and that's an example of how what we see depends on where we sit. I could make a very logical argument that it had less to do with racism than fear because we were attacked. And as you were saying, there's no reason we couldn't be attacked again. So it was a preemptive, and especially in those areas along the coast which were most vulnerable. That's one way to view what went on. The other way to view is that it was easier to intern the Japanese because they looked less like us than the Germans did. Right?
Probably a combination of both, truth be told.
Well, and that's one of the challenges in studying history. For those of you thinking about going to law school, what's the famous mantra in law? It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
Mm-hmm.
So we can make all these conjectures all the time, but in the absence of evidence, it's a nice discussion. But currently, most of the literature suggests it was based on this fear of future attack. As with most things that happen in life, very few things have one motivation or one cause behind it. That gets to be the challenge that comes up with that. Yeah, Richard Neustadt, again, one of the leaders in the research on the American presidents. He talks about presidential power as the power to persuade. One of the definitions of leadership is the ability to get other people to do what you want and think it's their idea. So most of what leadership is about is getting, and we talked about this before when we referenced Deborah Stone's definition of problems, that idea of the strategic representation of situations, that idea that if you follow my definition of the problem, I'm ahead of the curve on the solution. I was having a discussion with a person at a meeting Monday afternoon and was talking about the importance of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in protecting America. And I looked at him and said, do you really think that a couple North Vietnamese fishing trawlers were a threat to an American destroyer? Do you really think that was going on? Yeah, could they have had aggressive action? Yeah. But the real issue was to provide a foundation, a justification to start bombing North Vietnam. Right? So this persuasion comes in a lot of different ways. And again, there's enough, yes, one of our U.S. vessels was put at risk by North Vietnam, but it wasn't the way it was described as an outright attack kind of thing. It was minor incursion at best. Right? But this idea of the power to persuade. It's interesting. I have a friend of mine who has 3 daughters, and the oldest daughter was going off to college, and the 2 younger daughters had shared a room. So there was now an open bedroom in the house. And one of the daughters went and made an impassioned plea that she's the oldest, she gets the room by herself. The younger daughter put together a PowerPoint presentation using 3D image of rearranging furniture and what the room would look like. I thought it was impressive. They still went with the older daughter, but this idea of what we usually try to persuade. Right? And what's one of the easiest ways to persuade people to support and do something? How it benefits them. You know, how this is enhancing your life, how your life is going to be easier, those kind of things. And so you use that. So they cut deals. There's a whole body of literature out there on strategic voting and how that can be used as a way to persuade and gain support for things. But again, what you have now is the increased polarization. You have the increased use of social media, the increased debate and discussion over what is and what isn't real news, what's fake news. And then we deal with people's pre-existing beliefs and reinforce those. And those become the challenges we have. That's the good news about social media, but it's also a bit of a negative use of what social media is able to do and capable of doing in the process. but this idea of the power of the president is the power to persuade. And again, with the increased use of technology, that's still a major challenge they have, but they no longer have a corner on the market on getting a message across. So now multiple terms. And even after the State of the Union, the out party often has a rebuttal speech that follows to talk from a different perspective. Yeah. This idea of having staff. One of the TV shows that I love, and I've been thinking about doing a inquiry class on the difference between House of Cards and West Wing and their portrayal of the White House and the president. Have any of you ever watched either of those shows?
I've seen like
I've seen
episodes,
clips
but
from
I
the
haven't seen the
Yeah.
whole series.
I've seen clips from the West Wing.
Yeah. West Wing was done during the 1990s, and it showed the political debate, but there wasn't the anger, the animosity, the physicality. House of Cards is a dirty, nasty, evil, wicked president and first lady who will do whatever it takes to win. So it's a much more aggressive view. And the argument would be is that our attitude of the president, the job of the president has changed. And our perception of the president has changed and what they have to do to get along. So anyway, having good staff. And so one of the folks that's a great character in both is the role of the press secretary, right, in dealing and sharing information, telling a story, keeping the media informed. Presidents are less and less using outright news conferences because they can get very off-the-wall questions asked and don't have near the control as they want. So oftentimes you have your staff deal with it. Staff can use this persuasion in the name of the president to the degree to which they allow access to various reporters and news outlets to other sides of the story or personal interviews, things of that nature. And the other one that's used, I think, in some ways a bit more today is this idea of going public. Highlighting to the public a major issue that's going on that we need to understand from a president's perspective is its partisanship gone wrong and the American public are suffering. For those of you, and I mentioned this again in the past, for those of you that may have watched any of the State of the Union address, President Biden took every opportunity he could to show where the Republicans were obstructionists, that they were standing in the way of progress, that they weren't doing what's best for the American people. And that was a way to go public, saying, wait a minute, we've talked about these things, we've made compromise, and they still refused. So going public in that way, putting pressure on the Republican Party theoretically.
Which honestly makes sense, because if you're trying to compromise and some people aren't willing to, especially if you talked with the other side.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the challenges that's come into our political system today. This idea of compromise is giving me what I want. The idea of compromise is you change your views so I can get the stuff that I want. And that's not what the American government was founded on. That's not been its tradition. And fortunately, the more level-headed within Congress in working with the president have that ability and willingness to compromise. But there are the extremes on both sides who are less willing to have compromise to deal with these issues as we move forward.
And they're feeling more likely for like a filibuster vote, either the traditional filibuster or like the vote.
Well, I mean, that's a congressional ploy and tool. And anybody who knows much about the filibuster, that's a way to hold up a final vote on issues. I believe the current standard is 60 votes to end filibuster. Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina was famous. And if you've never seen the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, is a great example.
Excellent movie.
Is a great example of the use of a filibuster and how after a bit of time you can generate support. And again, one of the challenges that comes about in all of these issues of politics is people's increasingly being unwilling to speak truth to power. The emperor has no clothes. This is an issue when perhaps things didn't go quite as well. You had President Bush at the scene of the 9/11 attacks saying, we can hear you and our enemies can hear us, great view. But staying on an aircraft carrier declaring victory, and the war went on for another, 16 years afterwards, perhaps it wasn't a shining moment. So this idea of using the media can in fact backfire. And most of you have probably never seen it, and I need to track down a picture of it. Michael Dukakis, governor of Massachusetts, is running for president, and somebody thought it'd be a good idea for him to get in a tank and drive across in a tank, showing his support for the military. Unfortunately, the helmet
that's gonna backfire.
unfortunately, the helmet that they gave him was much too large for his head. So all that you saw in the video was a bobblehead in the top of a tank, which didn't bode well for what he was trying to do. So this use of the media can go horribly wrong as appropriate.